Squatting is one of those functional movements that we do many times a day. We squat to sit down, we reverse that to stand back up, and we can squat to pick something off the floor. Analyzing the squat provides many important clues as to the origin of people's problems involving their feet, knees, hips, and back. We watch how people move. Watch how well they can stabilize their trunk and pelvis on their hips, how well they can stabilize their pelvis over their feet. Can they maintain ideal posture and alignment? Can they maintain ideal support? Infants and young children squat really well, and most Asian cultures spend much of their time in a deep squat position. Unfortunately, in the Western world, most adults do not squat well, which is why many people suffer from a myriad of problems involving their feet, knees, hips, and back. In this video, we're going to provide detailed instructions on how to learn how to squat with ideal patterns. Thank you. Before we begin to learn how to squat, it's essential that we learn how to set up the initial position, beginning with foot support, aligning the knees and relative to the feet, positioning the trunk and the pelvis as well. So we're going to begin with foot position. Ideally, what would I like to see is have people position their feet so they're somewhere between hip and shoulder width apart. So we're just going to bring Lana's feet into position so that she's roughly in between her hip and her shoulder width apart. Now, there's also quite a bit of controversy about how much turnout is ideal. Now, I like to keep it simple and just think about when the feet are in that position, what is the angle of the femur? And I like to keep a nice straight congruent line with the length of the femur and the length of the foot so that everything is in a nice straight line. So whatever position the feet are apart, there's going to be that appropriate amount of turnout with the feet. The next thing we need to establish is stabilization through the longitudinal arch as well as the transverse arch. Now we're going to start with the longitudinal arch. So I'm going to have Lana just allow her knees to collapse in like this. Now doing so is allowing her to bring her weight towards her first metatarsal head, the big knuckle behind the big toe. I want her to feel her weight come here and her really bring that big knuckle into the ground. So if I was to take my finger and put it under that part of her foot, I don't want her to allow me to lift that off the ground. Now with her establishing this point of support, I want her to feel like she's pushing from here to bring her knee out in alignment so it's in line with the second or the third toe. Now, quite typically what people are given instructions to do when they're squatting so their knees don't collapse, they're told just push your knees out. But what ends up happening is they start to weight bear on the outside of the foot, taking all their weight off the inside, leaving that medial arch completely unstable, which will completely affect how the hip functions. So we're going to come back in, my fingers under her first metatarsal head, I'm lifting and she's pushing into my finger to make sure that stays on the ground. Now with my fingers on the outside of her knee, I want her to push out so that her knee comes into alignment with the second or third toe. Perfect, just like that. Now she's going to keep working on loading into my finger, not letting her knee collapse in. We need to come out just a little bit more. Perfect. Next, we're going to work on creating stabilization of the transverse arch. Now, if she were to lift her toes off the ground, staying into my finger, staying on here, she's going to lift her toes and fan them out and then lay them back down on the ground. So we want the toes to rest on the ground, but they should never be gripping or clawing the ground. That is not an ideal support function of the toes. The toes should be just resting on the ground. With long toes spread out, automatically the muscles that stabilize the transverse arch should come engaged and we should see a fullness through here. Next is how far forward should the knees be? Ideally, the knees should be roughly the same distance forward to be in line with the toes. So I'm going to have Lana scoot her bum forward just a little bit right there. Now she's ideally aligned, the knees forward in line with the toes. The center of her kneecap is in line with the second or third toe. The next step then is to position the trunk and the pelvis in their ideal position. The pelvis should be neutral. It shouldn't be swayed nor rounded. Quite often, what we see is people have too much sway in their back. So we'll have them just either feel like they're trying to pull the tailbone down towards the surface they're sitting on, or pulling the pubic bone up towards their sternum. So rotating the pelvis back into its neutral position. Be careful you don't go too far and tilt the pelvis backwards. The next item is to bring the trunk over the pelvis into a neutral position. So we're going to have her lean forward a little bit more so that her center of mass is sitting over her feet. And then next, the head retracts back, keeping the chin tucked so the head is in line with the trunk. Now we have an ideal position of the head in line with the trunk positioned in line with the pelvis is neutral, the knee is in line with the feet. And now we're ready to begin the squat exercise. So now we're going to begin exercising towards an ideal squat. We're going to begin by simply going from a sitting towards a standing position and then back to sitting. But before we get there, we have to make sure we can establish proper foot load and gradually increase that load towards standing. So all I'm going to have Lana do from here, again, is she's going to bring her body forward so she feels her body weight coming towards her feet. Next, I want to make sure that she creates that proper stabilization through her abdominal cylinder by creating intra-abdominal pressure. I need to feel that pressure through here through the whole time. I'm going to come around to the front and watch as she feels like she's trying to push the floor away from her. So she's pushing her feet into the ground, maintaining proper alignment from her pelvis all the way up to her head. I'm watching to make sure her knees don't collapse in, and she's going to begin to upright herself coming to me. So she's pushing the floor away, and I want her just to hold that position and breathe deep and strong, then feel like she's trying her best with the intention of lifting her bum off the box. And she's pushing, 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 and we stop. Now we're going to take that one step further, and I'm going to have her actually begin to lift herself up to standing. So I'm going to give her the direction I want her to come. She's going to be coming towards me and vertically at the same time. Now this is a strength move. It's not a lunge yourself forward. Quite typically what I see people do is when they're trying to come up, they just simply create momentum and they launch themselves forward. The back is swayed, their knees are collapsing. This is meant to be done with control, where you are literally loading your feet, pushing your feet into the floor, and then gradually coming up. So she's coming back into the same position, all the same ideals, pushing away, and she's gradually bringing herself to me. And then from there, we're going to have her sit back down, and we're just going to floss that movement back and forth, and then back down. Now the next progression would be to do this exact same movement, but on a lower surface. The lower down we go, the more challenging it is. So now she's demonstrated really good technique sitting on a higher surface, and we wouldn't make such a big drop in reality. We would do it more in a more graduated fashion, but Lana's quite good at this, so we're just going to drop down to a much lower surface to demonstrate the idea is Everything remains the same foot position, support, the pelvis, the trunk, the head, all in alignment. She's going to bring her body weight forward, and she begins to push the floor away and coming forward and up at the same time. Now we had a little bit of a loss of position here, so I'm going to come around to make sure that she doesn't lose her neutral pelvis position. So pressure here as she's coming up, because she has a tendency to go into a little bit of anterior pelvic tilt. She needs to be sure that she's pulling up on her pubic bone as she comes up and back down. Now, ideally, as we're coming up, we're going to be hinging at the hip so the trunk comes up more vertically. A nice smooth progression into standing, and then we're going to begin with knees bent and then coming back down. Now, if the full motion is too difficult, we can just do a very small portion of that movement where she's going to load and come up and then back down. Come forward, load her feet and up and back down. And one more time, and load and come up and hold. We can simply hold and breathe into that and just feel how the whole body is connecting and pulling using foot support, and then back down. So far we've been using the sitting to standing to develop the squat pattern. Now we're going to begin in a standing position using a box for support to go down in towards squat, and she's only going to go down as far as she can maintain all the ideal alignments and support. So she's going to grab hold of the box. She's going to begin with knees bending, bringing her knees forward so they're in line with the toes, and then she begins by hinging. She's hinging at the hip and bringing her pelvis backwards as she drops down, and she's going to come back up. So we're going to do that slower step by step. And again, it's begin with knees bending in line with the toes. And then as she does that, I want to make sure the pelvis stays neutral, so the tailbone's pulling down towards her feet. Her head is pulling back over her trunk. And as she goes down, her pelvis has to push back so her knees stay in that perfect position. And she's always working on breathing and pressurizing into her abdominal canister. And then again, she pushes the floor away and comes back up. And we're just going to floss small movements back and forth like that. Now, it's best to only go down as far as you can maintain proper foot support. We don't want to see the heels lift or the tendency of the feet to flare out to the side. If you can't go down that far, only go down as far as you can maintain all the ideals. And one more time, knees bend, push back and down, hold and breathe. Feel how your body's connecting to your feet and your feet are connecting to the ground. The next movement in the series is going to be one that's called the goblet squat. Now, holding a weight in front of the body can actually make the squat pattern easier to do. A lot of people would think the weight makes it more difficult. Actually, having the center of mass in front of your body makes it easier to keep your upper torso more vertical. So all the same ideals. Start with knee bend. Knees come forward in line with the toes. So we're going to have her bend her knees further and right there. Now, as she goes lower down, the pelvis has to translate backwards, but we don't want her to lose her ideal alignment of her trunk and her pelvis and her head. And she comes back up and moving slowly, flossing those movement patterns. We never want to see the knees come forward past the toes. We don't want to see the heels lift. And back down. And we can simply hold and breathe into that position, or we can make slow movements up and down, and then back up. And that's the goblet squat. The next exercise in the position is an isometric loading in the deep squat position. The idea is to choose a weight that is more than you can lift, one that's enough that you can pull hard against to really challenge your ability to maintain all the ideals of posture, alignment, loading, pressurization, and not falling apart. It's a great way to see exactly when and where people fall apart in their movement pattern. So Lana's going to go down into this deep squat position. And from there, she's going to begin to come up, and she's going to lift as hard as she can, creating as much load through her entire system as she can, while maintaining all the ideal alignment of the head, the trunk, the pelvis, loading into her feet and breathing. We don't want to see anything fall apart, where typically people will start to flex their spine, they'll arch their spine, their knees will collapse in. We want to make sure that pressure is being maintained in the cylinder, and she's just going to hold that and breathe deep into her cylinder for several breaths. And then we'll let go. Perfect, and come back up. And that can be repeated for several repetitions as well.